A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, let's turn our attention to how Christians think about the Old Testament's law. Andrew McColl from Family Voice Australia. He's the State Director in Queensland, back with us. Hey, Andrew, welcome back to 2020.
Thank you, Neil. Good morning to you and good morning to our listeners today.
Hey, a good topic to talk about, and I know you like to start with biblical foundations for these sorts of things. Where do you want to start?
Well, I thought I'd start this morning, Neil, with Psalm 119, verse 97, which says, "Oh, how I love your law. It is my meditation all the day." Now, the psalmist, of course, Neil, wrote those words some 1,000 years BC, before Jesus came to earth. Does that make a difference? Well, my answer to that question is yes and no.
Okay, Andrew, so two bob each way, a yes and no. And I know this is a live debate for some people. Yes, of course, the Old Testament law matters. Some say, but hang on a second, isn't that, as you say, 1,000 years BC? What does that mean for us in the 21st century? Let's start with your yes. Why is the yes important here?
Well, yes, Neil, because the New Testament means there are many changes. When Jesus died, the veil in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. This meant that from that moment, the whole Old Testament sacrificial system was made obsolete and done away with. The true Lamb of God had fulfilled all of it in the person of Jesus himself. Jesus became a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. That's a quote from Psalm 110, verse 4, and the guarantee of a better covenant, which Hebrews 7 and verse 22 tells us. Absolutely amazing. Furthermore, with that, Neil, along with all of the ceremonies pertaining to the temple and the priesthood, circumcision, the land laws, the food laws, and the seed laws, they're done away with too. And the notion of a promised land for God's people has shifted to the Great Commission to all the nations. No longer just a little piece of land at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. No, it's all the nations now, Jesus told us.
Okay, so you have this Old Testament law given to the people of God, the children of Israel, and long time BC. Here we are, 21st century, and we can appreciate, yes, some of those elements of that Middle Eastern context of an ancient people are fulfilled and done away with because of the sacrifice of Christ. Let's talk about the other side here. What about the components of the law that might remain unchanged and relevant to us?
That's a very good question, Neil. So let's consider this from a historical perspective. Johannes Piscator, who lived from 1546 to 1625, he was a Bible teacher and theologian in the Reformed tradition. He understood the church's great need to apply the law of God, located primarily in the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. But Piscator went one essential step further. He realized that the case laws, which are located in the Bible in Exodus 21, 22, and 23, were an essential component of this because they serve us like manufacturers' instructions for working out or utilizing the Ten Commandments. His views were frequently accepted by subsequent theologians in England, in Scotland, and the American colonies. And for those of us who have a Baptist background or a Baptist tradition, we might be familiar with the theologian John Gill. Well, Gill quoted from Piscator literally hundreds of times. So he thought very highly of what he was saying. So Piscator wrote, and I quote, "The judicials, that is the laws from the Ten Commandments, are laws of the right of contracts and of the punishment of those who have committed an offence, issued so that justice among the people and public tranquility may flourish, and that the laws of God may be vindicated from contempt. He subsequently published an article or a book called Disputations on the Judicial Laws of Moses, which was an important but relatively brief document where he began to go into detail in his application of God's law today.
Wonderful to reflect on case studies, because, clearly when there are case studies today, that's where you start to form precedents, isn't it, in our modern law system. So so when we talk about the commandments, take one, for example, thou shalt not steal, having such far-reaching impacts on the way that a society might flourish, and you might have a harmonious living and working together, because all of a sudden I own something and you don't have any right to steal it, or that's my spouse, you don't have any right to steal my spouse. You've got to actually be a person of integrity in business, because otherwise you're stealing from me. So really, really powerful stuff here. So do these sorts of judicial laws continue today? Any other examples? Any other amazing commandments that you can draw on?
Well, yes, we can look at the Ten Commandments, of course, and the sixth commandment says, "You shall not murder." We find that in Exodus 20, verse 13. Now, those 4 words are short on detail. What about self-defense from an intruder, or what about warfare? If I discover an intruder in my house one night and after a violent struggle I kill him, have I done wrong? The case laws in Exodus 22 verses 1 to 4 say, no, I have not done wrong. We may have heard about the castle law legislation brought to the Queensland Parliament last year by the Katter Party. The Katter Party are onto something. Thank God for the Katter Party. The second thing that this text teaches us, Neil, is the biblical principle of restitution for theft and many other crimes. This intruder, if he's apprehended and he survives, shall surely make restitution. That's in verse 3, which could be as high as 5 times the value of what that criminal was stealing. That reminds us that our modern decisions to jail criminals has no relationship to the Bible.
Just pause here for a moment. So if we're looking for biblical precedents and principles here, and these have been worked out in societies now over millennia, there is the thought that jail time for criminals might not be enough. There needs to be some level of restitution from things like theft. That actually does fly in the face of what we might see today in our own legal system here. Is that the case, do you think?
Yes, it does fly in the face. And this is where, as I'm saying, we need to think again about how we deal with crime, how we deal with criminals. What about an accident, or if a death is caused by negligence? Now, we get light on those kinds of issues when we go to Exodus 21, which begins to explain these things. So, 5 verses of Exodus 21 deals with an ox that gores other oxen or people. The owner of the ox is considered to be responsible for his ox's behaviour. He could even lose his life for this if he had been warned about his ox in the past. From this we can and should learn the need for logical extrapolation in a court of law. If the owner of the ox that gored was responsible for his animal, what about people? Aren't we responsible too? Injury and death through negligence requires that someone bears responsibility. What about the drunk driver that kills an innocent person? So there's more, there's much more. We have to think too, Neil, do we believe that there is an inescapable cause and effect relationship between individual, family, and national covenantal faithfulness and prosperity? The Bible teaches us that the one who despises the word will be in debt to it, but the one who fears the commandment will be rewarded. That's Proverbs 13, verse 13. God told his people through Moses, so keep the words of this covenant to do them, that you may prosper in all that you do. Deuteronomy 29, verse 29. The Bible also teaches us that blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen for his own inheritance. That's Psalm 33 and verse 12.
And some foundations there for how a nation prospers, because if you can prosper in your own family, and that therefore extends to your community, to your state, to your nation. So national prosperity along the lines of simple common sense type things like that. We might call them common sense, I guess, because the foundation has been there in God's law. So Old Testament law, Andrew, that should impact our law today. People say, well, our law's so sophisticated, and there's volume upon volume upon volume of law. But how do you think these Old Testament laws should impact our laws today?
Well, they certainly should. So the Bible teaches us in Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 to 19, that there are 7 things that God hates. One of them being hands that shed innocent blood. Now, if innocent blood is important to God, shouldn't it be for us too? Some of us have been thinking about this matter of innocent blood in Queensland recently, such as in the context of late-term abortion. And it just so happens that the matter of the child in the womb is referred to in the case laws in Exodus 21, verses 22 to 25.
Just pause here for a moment, Andrew, because when we're talking about these very modern and very controversial issues, and, we've been talking about babies born alive. This is the sort of context that you're talking about here. So what you're saying is there is a very direct biblical connection to even this modern law of babies born as a result of an abortion, but being left alive and in a metal tray to die. Alive for sometimes up to 45 minutes, an hour beyond, and no help given, even though that's a living child. What does the Bible say about this?
Well, the Bible says that if men struggle with each other and strike a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet there is no injury, he shall surely be fined as the woman's husband may demand of him, and he shall pay as the judges decide. But if there is further injury, then you shall appoint as a penalty life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Now, this is not the taking of vengeance, which the Bible expressly forbids, nor is it the striking out of an eye to compensate for the victim's eye. No, this law requires financial restitution to the aggrieved person, even if the child referred to is unharmed. What if the child were harmed? This biblical principle put into law would revolutionise how we deal with criminals. For instance, Neil, if you suffered a violent assault and your wonderful face you received facial and dental injuries that cost you $5,000 to get repaired, wouldn't you be glad, if that violent person was found guilty in a court of law and was compelled to pay you at least $10,000? That would be biblical justice in action. So this is the second case where the Bible's case laws are directly relevant to justice in Australia, and there are many more.
Well, I guess when you talk about a remedy for wrong being done to you, I know that there's lots of different elements, certainly in civil actions and those things like that happen in our law that might cause that remedy to go to the right person, and a judge who sits on the bench decides how much and how far that goes. Hey, if we're drawing some conclusion to these sorts of things and really the sorts of things talking about today, Andrew, are going to need a second listen to be able to just capture some of the finer points, because you're quoting some scriptures there and there's some examples. How do we conclude a conversation like this around the Old Testament law?
Well, this is the first of three parts, Neil, so our listeners do get two more chances to listen to me on this. But just for today, it was G.K. Chesterton who declared that every civilization decays by forgetting obvious things. So the church's rediscovery of the case laws of Exodus and our wholesale embrace of them, and the willingness to press for their wholesale utilisation in the community, state and nation will be one essential key for the goodness of the Lord to be seen in our nation. Is that what you'd like to see? Is that what you'd want to be a part of? Well, this would mean that at long last, Christians have relocated our manufacturer's manual, and we've finally been determined to do what it said.
And good to talk about legal aspects of Old Testament law, how they might relate in New Testament times and in our current setting. And some people have a little issue around this, and a very simplistic view says, don't worry about all that law stuff, we're saved by grace. But I boiled this down some years ago and came to the conclusion that we are saved by grace, but nations function on laws. So whose laws are our nation functioning on? And if they're just shifting sand all the time, we're probably in trouble. If we go for something that comes from our Creator, something that has a transcendence about it, those laws are going to be very important for us. Andrew McColl, as you say, we're going to do a series on these, and listeners will have to wait until next time to be able to get part 2. Then you might be able to explore some of those on a podcast. But Andrew McColl, he is the Family Voice Australia State Director for Queensland. You can connect with Andrew through familyvoice.org.au. I do always like to mention too, Andrew, you've written a number of books, and not all on this topic. Maybe this sort of thing will be coming in a book sometime, your next one, but you've got 4 books here that I've got. They Shall Become One, The Significance of the Godly Family, Inherit the Earth, and The Great Christian Revolution. Biblical foundations for the way we think about those things in our lives. So familyvoice.org.au to connect with Andrew. Andrew, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
Always a pleasure, Neil. Thanks so much.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.